Hello and welcome to part 3 of the Australian Unemployed Workers Union's online advocacy course. This part is called Asserting Your Rights in a Job Plan. Here I'm going to go over the Australian Unemployed Workers Union's approach in helping unemployed workers get their rights recognised. Before I go into how unemployed workers go about asserting their rights, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the contracts, because the contracts make it very, very difficult for unemployed workers to assert their rights. And this is very, very deliberate. Let's have a look at the Job Active Contract. So the Job Active Contract, like the Disability Employment Services Contract and the CDP contract, was introduced in 2015 by the Tony Abbott government. And this contract was very, very different to the previous JSA contract. And as you can see from this graph here, under the Job Active system, there were two key changes. Firstly, the amount of funds the government provided to job agencies upfront reduced significantly to 40% of the total amount of funds. And secondly, the amount of money given to job agencies that was tied to outcomes increased significantly to 60%. So all of a sudden, under this new system, job agencies weren't getting upfront funds to provide employment services. The majority of the money that job agencies got was tied to outcomes, and this was known as the outcome-driven system. So job agencies were put in this position where, in order to get money, and remember, they're private businesses that need to make money just like every other business, and the only way for them to make money was by meeting certain outcomes. And these outcomes mostly involve putting unemployed workers either into employment or into certain activities where there is funding attached. This new outcome-driven employment services system created an array of financial incentives for job agencies to push people into outcomes. And this has led to a whole series of abuses occurring within the employment services system. So it's really important to see job agencies as private companies that exist to make money. And under this contract, it's actually becoming harder and harder for job agencies to make money. So they're resorting to all sorts of shady tactics to increase the amount of funding they're getting from the government. And I've just got a few examples here of the sort of tricks that job agencies are getting up to make money. So the first one I'd like to talk about is the star ratings reward. Under the job agency system, each agency is rated according to the star rating system. The star rating system measures job agencies according to the amount of outcomes that they're achieving, and also according to the amount of long-term unemployed people they have on their books. One of the things that we've seen is that job agencies are actually trying to get long-term unemployed people off their books in order to increase their star rating. The higher their star rating, the more likely it is they're going to get the next contract. And considering there's billions of dollars on the line, job agencies go to really extreme lengths in order to boost their star rating. So we heard an example of an unemployed worker who was actually forcibly transferred out of his agency because he was long-term unemployed. We believe it's quite likely that job agencies are deliberately treating long-term unemployed workers badly in the hope they transfer out. And the more long-term unemployed workers they get off their books, the better their star rating, the more likely they are to get the next contract. Another reward here is the pay slip reward, where unemployed workers are harassed by job agencies for their pay slip. This is so job agencies can get another payment from the government. And job agencies approach unemployed workers and say that they are required to provide them their pay slips. There is nothing in any of the deeds which states that job agencies are allowed to do that, or unemployed workers are required to provide their pay slips. But job agencies, desperate for money, are harassing people for their pay slips. Then there's the work for the dole reward. This is something that we've already gone through in part 2, but I'll just mention again briefly, is when job agencies bully and pressure unemployed workers to attend a work for the dollar activity, even though they have the right to attend a voluntary activity or an approved study activity. And this is done because job agencies get a payment for when they put people into work for the dollar activities. So it's just a clear conflict of interest there. Next is the job club rule, where job agencies force unemployed workers into attending these training programs where they have to come into their job agency for 3 or 4 days a week and look for jobs on the computers. What's happening here is that the job agency is claiming money for each person they force into these training programs. They've set up their own training arm and they're simply feeding unemployed workers into that training organisation. What they're not telling unemployed workers is that they have the option not to attend, that it's strictly a voluntary activity. What they do is they bully unemployed workers into attending those activities by threatening them with penalties. And this is a really, really big one. This is where job agencies are making a lot of their money, by setting up training organisations and then just pushing people into their own training arms and then making money off each person who comes in. Then there's the appointments rule. As we saw in part 2, unemployed workers in job active only have to attend a minimum of 1 appointment per month, and in DES a minimum of 2 appointments per month, and in CDP also a minimum of 1 appointment per month. But what we're seeing is that job agencies are demanding that unemployed workers come in and attend far more appointments than they're required to attend. This is a tactic to harass unemployed workers in order to force them into outcomes, such as a dodgy training program, a job that they wouldn't normally want to do, or even just pushing them off the system altogether. Then there's the compliance rule. This involves job agencies not following the compliance process properly and simply cutting people off without following the proper steps and without giving unemployed workers an opportunity to explain themselves. And this is clearly part of the business model of many job agencies, where they just want to harass unemployed people into outcomes so they make more money. This is a very, very important component of the system that really underpins the entire industry, is job agencies penalising people when they don't do what they want them to do, even though they may be asking them to do too much. And then finally, there's the basic services rule. And this is probably one of the most egregious rules, because it's just a case of job agencies not providing any services to people. Job agencies are contractually obliged to provide these services, as we saw in Section 2, but in many cases they're simply not providing them. And as there is no oversight, or very, very little oversight from the Department of Employment to rein in badly performing job agencies, they're allowed to continue to get away with these rules. And this is where the Unemployed Workers Union's advocacy line really steps in, and we need to become the regulators, because the Department of Employment, who created this industry, have a clear conflict of interest when it comes to policing it. It's sort of like asking the police force to investigate a police officer. There's just a huge conflict of interest there, and we have to step in and be that body that comes in and informs unemployed workers about their rights, and also shames job agencies who do the wrong thing. I believe that if we empower every unemployed worker to expose this current system and ensure that their rights get respected, then this system would collapse. There's no way under the current funding model that job agencies could actually provide the services that they're meant to provide. And that's why it's so important, the work we do, in order to give unemployed workers a voice. And just quickly, appealing decisions with Centrelink is actually quite an effective tool that unemployed workers have. As you can see from this graph, 37.5% of appeals were successful. That involved a change decision by Centrelink. So there are a lot of success stories out there of people asserting their rights and fighting back against being unfairly penalised by this punitive system. So then the question comes, how do we go about asserting unemployed workers' rights. How do unemployed workers assert their rights? Here is a flowchart showing a typical case of an unemployed worker asserting their rights. So in the first place, you have a job agency disrespecting the rights of an unemployed worker. The first step then would be for the unemployed worker to contact the Unemployed Workers Union or educate themselves about their rights on our website. From there, we recommend that unemployed workers contact their job agency articulating their rights. We provide template letters for this, and within that, as they're contacting their job agency, make a request. A common request would be to demand their job plan be renegotiated to be fair. Then the job agency would respond, hopefully in writing, to the unemployed worker, informing them of their decision, whether they agree to renegotiate the job plan or whether they don't agree. If the job agency doesn't agree to renegotiate the job plan, then we would recommend unemployed workers request a transfer to a different agency, lodge a complaint with the Department of Employment, and obviously call us up and pass on this story to their local MP, relevant politicians, or even the media. And then if the Department of Employment fails to process the complaint, then to contact the Commonwealth Ombudsman. Hopefully, in this particular case, it doesn't go to the point of the unemployed worker being cut off, but these are basically the tools that unemployed workers have at their disposal in negotiating with job agencies and trying to get their rights respected by their job agencies. So just a brief summary of the complaints system. The government has made available a few different bodies to handle complaints. So with Job Active, it's the Department of Employment that handles complaints, and this is a bit of a nightmare for people because the Department of Employment are often very, very hesitant to process complaints, or they just fob you off and say to deal with your job agency. So this is one of the reasons why the Unemployed Workers Union needs to step in. With the Disability Employment Services, it's a different complaints body. This is the Complaints Resolution and Referral Service, which is actually administered by the Department of Human Services, which I think is a much better system because the Department of Employment is kept out of it. With the CDP, the complaints are handled by the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and then there's the Commonwealth Ombudsman, which is meant to intervene when these complaints bodies don't do their job and refuse to process complaints. And just the important thing about dealing with these complaints bodies is that you really have to be assertive with them, because particularly with the Department of Employment, they want to fob you off at every point, and they're quite rude as well. So it's difficult to really make your complaint. The amount of times that we've heard stories of people complaining to the Department of Employment only to be just not given the time of day and just being told that they have no issue at all when there's a clear issue happening. Here's a bit of information about requesting a transfer to a different job agency. So the easiest way to request a transfer is by calling up the Department of Employment customer service line if you're with a job active agency, or the Complaints Resolution Referral Service if the unemployed worker is with a DES agency. And there are four main reasons unemployed workers can use to request a transfer. First is transfer by agreement, which is when the job agency and the unemployed worker comes to an agreement and a form is filled out. The second is change of address, so the job agency is actually too far away for the unemployed worker to go to, and there is a closer job agency. Third reason is relationship failure, which means that the job agent and the unemployed worker can no longer work productively together. And finally, there's better servicing, which is a very, very broad reason, which basically says that the unemployed worker could get better servicing if they went elsewhere. And judging by how the system is operating at the moment, I think most unemployed workers could make the argument that they could get better servicing elsewhere because their job agency is essentially failing to uphold their requirements. There are a few other tips on how to assert your rights. It's very effective for unemployed workers to bring in friends or family members into an appointment. That tends to really change the approach of the job agency. Bring in your own model job plan to renegotiate, and that's something that the Unemployed Workers Union is working on putting on our website shortly. Bring in an unemployed workers' rights guide and point to the particular sections of the deed and guidelines that you want to assert. Make sure you get a reference number when you make a complaint to the Department of Employment or Customer Service line and the DES referral service, and always ask for everything in writing, which is a really good tactic in order to keep job agencies honest. Which brings me to the main technique the Australian Unemployed Workers Union advocates when dealing with job agencies is sending a letter, just a clear letter outlining what rights the job agency has broken and what the unemployed worker demands of that job agency in terms of having a particular right respected. And this is a really important technique because it prevents the job agency bullying unemployed workers face to face, which is a really common way that job agencies manage to get their way. They just walk all over unemployed workers by threatening various penalties, and that means that job agencies tend to get their way. Asking unemployed workers to send letters also educates and empowers unemployed workers. It leaves evidence of the complaint, which is a really important way to get stories of this abuse out in the open. And hopefully every letter that unemployed workers send to their job agency, they forward on to us, and the Unemployed Workers Union keeps an archive of all the different abuses that are happening, and we can then use that in our efforts to make this system better. And templates are easily accessible on our website. So we've created a range of templates on a number of different common issues which unemployed workers can simply go onto the website, download, fill in their details and send off. So it's quite an easy way for us to help unemployed workers. So here's an example of a common problem that we'll just discuss briefly, and I can then show you the way that we would advocate as an unemployed worker tackling this issue. So in this problem, Stream B, 25-year-old unemployed worker, wants to have her study counted to her annual activity requirement, but her agency says she has to do work for the dole. So what can she do and what rights are being abused here? As discussed in the previous section, every unemployed worker has the right not to do work for the dole if they're in job active. And this particular unemployed worker can assert their right to not do work for the dole and can have their study counted towards their annual activity requirement as long as it's approved study and it meets certain requirements. So in this case, we would advocate to this unemployed worker that they send through a template letter. And here is the example of the template letter that we would ask them to send through. So this template letter basically outlines what the rights are of unemployed workers around attending different activities. And here is a section of the Mutual Obligation Requirements Guideline, which clearly states that in addition to work for the dole, unemployed workers can attend a range of activities to meet their annual activity requirements, which includes part-time employment, unpaid work experience, voluntary work, part-time study, and training, but it has to be Certificate 3 or higher, accredited language, literacy, and numeracy courses, Defence Force reserves, and other government programs. And in this letter, we really try to make it clear that the job agency is breaking an element of the deed, and that we request that the job plan be renegotiated to reflect their rights in the deed. So I encourage people who are undertaking this online course to have a look at our templates that are available online, and the link should should be available to you in this section, and go through them and try to make yourself familiar with all the common issues that unemployed workers are facing in this punitive job agency system.